Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Chun-Wei Yap. I'm the Program Director for International Trade Research at the Heinrich Foundation. Welcome to a joint panel that we've organized today with the EU-ASEAN Business Council and the Heinrich Foundation. The foundation has as its mission the advancement of global sustainable trade, which of course includes foreign direct investment. And we are focusing today on a paper that we co-commissioned with the EU and the government of Japan from the OECD addressing sustainable FDI in ASEAN. And I know that for the OECD, this report has been a labor of love. They worked at it for about 2 years, and they spent a year of which, taking pains to build inroads into the ASEAN CCI, which is the Coordinating Committee on Investment, making sure that they had access to the troves of data that the ASEAN CCI has so that they can build on this data and come to the conclusions which are in this report. So we have today with us some of the most important people in the EU-ASEAN relationship. We have Chris Humphrey, who's the Executive Director of the EU-ASEAN Business Council. We have Catherine Diot, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Heinrich Foundation. We have Rino Donosaputra, who is Vice Chairman for ASEAN and the President Commissioner of Standard Chartered in Indonesia. We have Tan Tai Hyong, who is Head of Services and Investment for the ASEAN Secretariat. And we have Iris Mantovani, who is the Economist and Project Manager for the OECD and one of the co-authors of this report. So welcome, everyone. And Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon to everybody, or good morning if you're joining us from Europe. And welcome, as Chun-Wei said, to this very important discussion we are hosting here today. I think there's no doubt that ASEAN is a growth bright spot on the planet at the moment. All of the region is growing at phenomenal rates. The question is, how can we make that growth sustainable going forward? And how can we drive in more foreign direct investment into the green space in the region? This excellent report, which I would hope everybody can read at some point. You can scan it here and you can download the report. Really does shine a light on what's going on in terms of investments and sustainability beyond just green as well. It does talk about responsible business conduct at the same time. And I think this is an area which we all need to look at. It's an area actually where I think European businesses have a good story to tell. It's an area where ASEAN needs a lot more help going forward and recognizes it needs that help and assistance as well. Climate change is here. It's now, and we need to do more about it and tackling it. And that means making sure that we get the right investments into Southeast Asia to help the economic development continue, help alleviate poverty in the region, help make people's lives a lot better, but do so in a very green way. So I'm looking forward to a very stimulating discussion coming up now. With that, I'll hand back to Chun-Wei.
Thank you, Chris. I think you're absolutely right that Europe is right at the center of things when it comes to climate, and that European businesses have a lot to contribute in this area, climate change and climate policy, and the kind of investments that can be drawn into ASEAN. I think Europe is driving a lot of that change globally and in a regulatory sense across the world. And naturally, I think that the businesses would have that same nexus in Southeast Asia. And now over to Catherine, who is the CEO of the foundation. Catherine.
Thank you, Chun-Wei, and a warm welcome from all of us at the Heinrich Foundation. Thank you, importantly, to the EU-ASEAN Business Council for partnering with us today. Foreign direct investment, the topic for today, is a very important ingredient for the pursuit of greater trade capability. And so from our perspective at the Heinrich Foundation as a not-for-profit, FDI and trade are inextricably linked in creating jobs and raising living standards. For instance, we've done some past research on the impact of FDI in China, and even today, FDI in China is still responsible for 33% of China's GDP and 27% of its employment, and we've quantified that in prior research projects. So FDI is going to be critical and for ASEAN development, we believe, and yet OECD data is showing that FDI has fallen some 43% in developing markets with a subdued outlook. And so in 2021, we were thinking about ways in which FDI could assist developing economies in ASEAN to build back better after the pandemic. And so it happened, the team from the OECD was thinking about the same issue too. So we partnered with the OECD team to identify ways in which ASEAN member states can use foreign investment for achieving sustainable growth goals. And the OECD team went about it with a high degree of collaboration with ASEAN member states in order to make their findings relevant and practical. And we congratulate everyone who participated in the project for achieving just that. Back to you, Chenwei.
Thank you, Catherine. And you know, you're absolutely right that that FDI is inextricably linked to trade. And there's an interesting nugget in the report that that OECD put out that talked about how, you know, aside from the usual the living standards that you talked about the spillover effects of economic development, that the participation of women, for one thing, as a result of FDI across Southeast Asia has risen, and that's something that the OECD report flagged as well, which is a really, you know, important. Just a little piece of information in this broad sweep that they did. And here to take us through the depths, you know, the whole breadth of this report is Iris Mantovani, who had a principal role in writing this report. And she's going to take us through its findings. Iris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chinwei, and good morning and good afternoon to all participants. I'm delighted to have the chance to present our work on this important topic and would like to thank the Henry Foundation and EU-ASEAN Business Council for organizing this very important webinar. Let me just share my screen. And I will, hold on, this is, just want to see if I can make it. Okay, do you see a full screen now? Yes. So the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework puts strong emphasis on sustainable investment and refers to a number of OECD instruments for policy action. As Chinwei mentioned, and thanks to the support of the Henry Foundation, the EU and Japan, and building on a strong and long-lasting cooperation with ASEAN to collect new data and use new OECD indicators and tools, the OECD was able to apply these tools to provide analysis and directions for policy on promoting sustainable investment, and in particular, giving special attention to unlocking investment for ASEAN's green growth and decarbonization. The results of this research were discussed at the OECD Investment Committee and ASEAN Committee on Investment, and the report was published in January 2023. And of course, the OECD stands ready to assist in further work on sustainable investment in ASEAN. So today I'll present some of the key findings relating to our report, focusing on investment for green growth in the region and enabling the green transition. As Chris stated, we all know that ASEAN is a major engine of global economic growth. And while at very different stages of development, almost all ASEAN economies have doubled in size since 2000. But this rapid growth and high development have come at the cost of high levels of pollution and environmental degradation. ASEAN's carbon emissions more than doubled over the last 2 decades, and 5 ASEAN member states account for more than half of global plastic waste emitted to the ocean. Many species face extinction due to pollution, land degradation, and use changes and illegal trafficking. We also know that ASEAN is highly vulnerable to climate change. 3 ASEAN member states are among the 10 most affected countries in the world to extreme weather events. And according to some estimates, climate change could wipe out over 35% of the region's GDP by 2050. So addressing these considerable challenges is going to require investment, but particularly it's going to require better aligning investment with green growth. FDI can play an important role in this regard by contributing the needed technological and capital resources to deliver greener and more sustainable growth and development. So let me briefly present a few slides on recent developments relating to FDI in the region and then move on to our policy findings. In this slide, we're looking at overall investment inflows into the region, FDI inflows into the region on the left, and greenfield or new investment flows over the last 4 years on the right. So it's clear that FDI growth has been enormous in the last 2 decades. And indeed, FDI has been a major driver of the region's growth, contributing to job creation, to skills upgrading, and as Chinwe mentioned, also to greater gender equality in the workplace. But we see also that Greenfield FDI was hard hit by the pandemic, and as of mid-2022, had not yet started to recover. We also see here, and we find in our report, that FDI has not always been aligned with green growth and climate objectives. For instance, as you see in the top left quadrant, foreign firms' carbon emissions per unit of output in Thailand are double that of domestic firms on average. And this gap is driven primarily by certain manufacturing industries and the electricity sector, where foreign multinationals are likely to operate in the most polluting segments of the value chain. On the top right panel, we also see that fossil fuels still account for over 88% of greenfield FDI stocks that goes to energy generation in 6 ASEAN countries, as shown by the blue bars. So there's still scope for increasing the contribution to the green growth and decarbonization in the region. Moving on to our policy findings, we find that ASEAN member states have committed themselves to environmentally sustainable development, as reflected by their ratification of most major multilateral environmental agreements, including the 3 Rio Conventions and most major MEAs on biodiversity, climate and atmosphere, land and water resources, and chemicals and waste. We see in this slide that all ASEAN member states have signed and ratified the Paris Agreement and submitted their nationally determined contributions, whereby they commit to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. All countries in the region have also updated these NDCs with strengthened targets, greater clarity, and greater transparency in line with the 5-year cycle of the Paris Agreement. But collectively, the ASEAN NDCs are not yet fully aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Only 4 countries have committed to achieving net zero by 2050, and another 3 countries by 2060 and beyond. 4 countries, Cambodia, Indonesia, Singapore, and Thailand, are the only ones to have submitted long-term strategy documents in addition to their NDCs. These strategies are very important because they link short-term objectives of the NDCs with the longer-term net zero goals. And they guide countries in avoiding costly investments in high emissions technologies. They support just and equitable transitions, and they send, in particular, early and predictable signals to investors about envisaged long-term societal changes. So developing these long-term strategies is also a very important aspect that other ASEAN countries should consider. We also find that there's a lack of cohesive regional target setting, with targets often expressed differently between countries and varying level of detail in terms of commitments and implementation plans. And we see that only 3 countries in the region have incorporated specific targets for emissions reductions in the transport sector, although this sector is responsible for 1/4 of ASEAN's CO2 emissions. Setting targets for increased investment in low emissions transport infrastructure could help advance ASEAN's climate targets and ambitions. In this next slide, we're looking at ASEAN approaches to environmental impact assessment, and in particular, whether various elements are fully, partially, or not at all included in the corresponding national legal frameworks. We find that ASEAN countries have made great strides in formalizing environmental impact assessment into their legal frameworks, with most providing for the 3 critical procedural rights of public participation, access to information, and access to justice. However, only 5 countries in the region have established frameworks for strategic environmental assessment to examine the environmental and social impact of proposed plans, policies, and programs. And only 3 countries have developed a legal framework for the application of EIA principles to the transboundary impacts of investment, including consulting the authorities of affected countries, neighboring countries. So we find that recognition of strategic environmental assessment and transborder environmental impact assessment at the ASEAN level could encourage other ASEAN governments to adopt these tools in their national EIA systems. In the report, we also looked at various forms of financial support for green investment. And one aspect that emerged as important is the alignment of incentive schemes with environmental objectives. Indeed, as you see in this table, all ASEAN economies provide corporate income tax incentives to promote green investment. These incentives typically target green sectors like renewable energy or bioplastics or electric vehicles. They also target improvements in energy performance and in some cases, green innovation. But as you can see in the table, 5 ASEAN countries offer similar incentive packages to green and non-green substitutes in targeted sectors. For instance, both renewable and conventional energy generation are eligible for a corporate tax holiday of 5 to 20 years in Indonesia and 5 to 10 years in Malaysia. And similar incentives are also granted to both bioplastics and conventional plastics in Thailand and Malaysia. In addition to being very costly in terms of foregone public revenue, this reduces the ultimate effectiveness of the incentive packages and efforts to promote green investment. In fact, we find that in Thailand, significantly more investment applications were received for non-biodegradable plastics than for bioplastics between 2016 and 2018. We conclude that ASEAN countries would benefit from classifying green and non-green activities in targeted sectors using emerging taxonomies and scaling down or phasing out costly incentives that are not aligned with their climate objectives or the Sustainable Development Goals more generally. In this last slide, we summarize different types of technical, administrative, and information support offered to green investors in the region. And these types of initiatives are important because they reduce barriers that may otherwise deter green investors, and they also help to promote green technology transfer and knowledge spillovers. The most widespread form of technical support that we see in the first 2 columns is training for workers and business support programs, which are important because they help to attract investors that seek skills related to green technologies and local business partners in green supply chains. Singapore and Vietnam have also put in place dedicated green technology parks and zones that help to promote green innovation and R&D. In addition to technical support, the most widespread forms of information support are public awareness campaigns, which help guide consumers and investors towards more sustainable products and services. IPAs in the region also offer sector-specific guidebooks and promote green investment opportunities and related incentive packages. Malaysia goes a step further with its green technology one-stop shop, which serves to fast-track investments that contribute to green growth. But one area where there are still missing frameworks and initiatives is on disclosure and reporting of environmental impacts. We see here that only Indonesia and Singapore have put in place frameworks and guides for sustainability disclosure at the national level, and Myanmar within the Tilawa SEZ. ASEAN could support other countries in the region in developing similar frameworks for voluntary disclosure of environmental impacts in critical sectors for green growth. I'd like to stop here and thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Iris. That was really that was a great presentation. And just taking a step back, aside from the frameworks and initiatives and recommendations that you put out, it seems to me that what the report is really saying is that removing restrictions to FDI in itself is not a panacea. And what's more important is to apply the thinking and the reform against standards that already exist that can help ASEAN reach sustainable outcomes, the Sustainable Development Goals being one of them, OECD FDI Index being another one. I think there was an interesting nugget in your report that said that for every 10% rise in an economy's position in OECD FDI Index, you get a 2% increase in inward FDI. So everyone's liberalizing, but it's quite patchy. I think the report also talks about how there's a greenfield decline, that there's a decline in greenfield investment in ASEAN. And certain economies are benefiting more than others. Vietnam and Indonesia, Malaysia and Singapore, much more than others. More than half of FDI, as you mentioned, of FDI gains in the last 10 years have gone to Singapore. just because of its place in the region as a hub. And so it'd be interesting to sort of hear from people who operate in other parts of Southeast Asia. And I think it's a great juncture at this point to sort of hand over to Rino Dono Seputra, who goes by Pak Doni, who has, wealth of experience in financing, including trade finance, I'm sure. So Pak Doni, over to you.
Chun Wei, thank you. And it's an honor to be part of this discussion today. I think, first of all, the publication is really a great step forward to help raise the awareness within the government of Southeast Asia about the need to link that FDI, which is already a very big theme actually for ASEAN, with the SDG and sustainability at large. The second part, it provides a very insightful mapping of the differences between the ASEAN markets, because we all know that ASEAN economies are very different. I mean, that's one of the part and parcel about ASEAN. It's a great region, growing, 700 million population, at 5% or more GDP growth in average, relatively young population. But the point is that it also differs in terms of the economic structure and the development stages. So this is actually great to put actually that into perspective. Quite a lot of useful insights in terms of how, for example, IPAs in each of the markets should collaborate together, align with international standards, and responsible business conduct, for example, again, within the report, reading the report, actually, I can see that some of the key pointers over there about, less restriction means more FDI coming in. I think actually that's really loud and clear. So there's quite a lot of actually useful things over there. But perhaps actually just to put an overlay over there, actually, from our perspective, I think, look, very clearly, I think ASEAN is one of the regions that would be affected the most by climate change, in need of sustainability. We talk about the SDG 17 goals in terms of access to water, and others on the social element side of things. It's not just climate, right? So I think that's very well understood by the government in ASEAN. But perhaps actually one aspect that should be elaborated or can be elaborated further, and it is implied in the report as well, is about the need for ASEAN governments to really collaborate. So when we talk about FDI, one of the things is that the fact of the matter, Standard Chartered, we are operating in all the 10 ASEAN markets, and we believe we are the only international bank operating in all the 10 ASEAN markets. So that's interesting because we see the way actually that each of the markets actually behave in attracting FDIs. The awareness is there. But frankly, actually what we see at the moment, there is still a lot of elements where each of the ASEAN member states or the AMS they are competing with each other when it comes to bringing FDI. And most of the countries actually are in need of FDIs. That's also the reason why we see that, as the report highlighted, that incentivizations between non-green and green FDIs often are very similar, because many of the ASEAN member states are really developing countries, and FDI contributes significantly. Indonesia, where I sit, for example, the second largest contributor to the GDP is foreign direct investment. So other than the domestic consumption. So again, actually, many countries, I'm sure Vietnam actually has very similar, perhaps actually it's the largest actually in Vietnam, and a few others. So what we need is actually that sort of notion that ASEAN can play a bigger part in the global supply chain shift by positioning ASEAN as a big player in the supply chain of the world. So for example, put it very simply, many of the ASEAN markets, and we help facilitate that, pitch in actively. So whether it's the investment ministers or chairman of the IPA of the relevant countries, actually going to US, Europe, Middle East, China, North Asia, and so on, actually to court foreign direct investors to come in. And that's where they really compete, and we see that firsthand, right? So instead of positioning each of the market, why don't we pitch ASEAN as a region as a whole, that they can play actually the different parts, right? Actually, because ASEAN markets actually, some countries actually will have a wealth of the natural resources, high-end production or manufacturing capability, services, and so on. We can combine that, overall together. So that would make actually a better sense. Now, within that, then, because it's a bit of a chicken and egg, I suppose, the perspective about, introducing the linkages very directly actually to the SDG element or sustainability element within that. Why I said it's a chicken and egg, because if you disincentivize the non-green side, as an example, you know, what about the other competitors do? I mean, competitors, quote unquote, within the region, right? I mean, that kind of action, if we, as suggested by the report, would have to be done in concert within the ASEAN framework. Hence, nobody is going to be losing out, right? So that's essentially actually how I think that element of international cooperation is actually very important. The second part, just to throw in as my last point, is the collaboration with the international world in the form of assistance, because energy mix, changing energy mix, and it's very different. But ASEAN has attracted actually a significant attention, as many of you actually may have heard about the JETP, Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is arguably the largest public-private partnership platform that aims specifically to accelerate net zero achievement of emerging markets. So there are 3 JETP countries in the world right now. 2 of them are in ASEAN, with Indonesia and Vietnam. The first one being South Africa, and Indonesia is the largest with 20 billion commitment. You got everybody actually behind it, all the backers. On the public sector, you got the G7 countries with the multilateral development banks, World Bank, ADB. On the other side, you got GFANZ, the Gulf Financial Alliance for Net Zero, represent the private sector. All the global banks, insurance, you know, and asset managers are on that side. The thing is that within that actually of specific JETPs, I think this is important actually for the ASEAN government as well, to ensure that following suit actually of that, Indonesia, Vietnam, in agreeing on that JETP concept, and both of them actually are now in the implementation stage, you know, to have that kind of open platform to create that assistance to come in, because JETP covers not just the direct financing, but also the capacity and capability building, all the way to alignment on the enabling environment, for example, you know, that alignment between the local taxonomies, the local sort of policy and regulations within each of the market with international standards. And that can help to precipitate. But certainly, I think one call out actually is that an element that ASEAN governments also need support from the OECD and the developed world.
Right.
Over back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Pak Donny. Those are really, really important points and very key. And I absolutely agree that energy is you know, clearly a leading candidate where ASEAN can play together. And I think you're right to point out that the main challenge is to figure out how far, you know, competition and cooperation, I mean, they both have to coexist, and how far that line has to be drawn. I didn't realize that Standard Chartered was the only bank, international bank, that operated in all 10 Southeast Asian countries. That's a
We
new.
do operate in all the 10 ASEAN markets.
Yeah, you're the only one.
To the best of our knowledge, actually, we are the only one, perhaps.
Oh, wow. Yeah, no, absolutely. So you're in a prime position to understand how ASEAN governments what they really need to do to collaborate. But I think, you know, Tae-hyung, who's here with us today, would be also in a perfect position to share a few comments on this, because he sees it from the overview of somebody who's worked with essentially all 10 countries. So Tae-hyung, do you want to step in here? You're on mute, Tae-hyung.
Yes, thanks. Chunwei, is it my turn now for my 5 minutes? So I'm responding to him. But anyway, let me just do some comments on this report. First of all, we appreciate for the EU-ASEAN Business Council and Heinrich Foundations, not only for inviting Secretariat for this session, but it's also a good initiative where we introduce more of what ASEAN has been doing in terms of sustainable investment to the general public, as well as hoping to get some good inputs from this webinar, because ASEAN is trying to do the next step from this report. So Let me start by highlighting that this report on enabling sustainable investment in ASEAN is produced by OECD in close cooperation with ASEAN Secretariat with our services and investment divisions. And we have a lot of consultations with members of the ASEAN Coordinating Committee on Investment, or CCI. And they are the government officials in charge of investment policy. So that's the context. Some background to why we have this report being done in collaboration with the OECD is because, first of all, ASEAN is always placing an important emphasis on sustainability. Of course, we all know we have to commit to SDG goal set by the UN process. But even when back in 2015, when we are devising our 10 years investment work program, we already set up some to do for us to do some policy dialogue on emerging issues in investment rulemaking, such as this one, sustainable development. So we do have such a plan. And with the pandemic outbreak in 2020, it's even more pressing, where ASEAN is realizing a need to get a consolidated exit strategy from this. And that's where the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, or ICRF, as mentioned by Iris earlier, this document came out where we want to do something to get out of this crisis. And sustainability, again, is one of the important themes of the ACRF. And one of the things in the ACRF is for CCI to explore initiatives to promote investment that contribute to SDG. And based on that mandate, then the CCI mandated Secretariat as well to organize a forum on sustainable investment in ASEAN back in November 2021. So that's the thing when we try to learn further about this topic, what has been done in ASEAN and other parts of the world, and we invite some international organizations. There are 5 of them, including the OECD. There is also WEF, UNESCO, ASEAN Japan Center, ASEAN Korean Center. So we have input from several, quite several good sources. And following from that, that's where OECD helped ASEAN further by offering to support in producing analytical report on this issue. Then that's where this report came about. And from the CCI perspective, this report is also one of the inputs that for CCI's further deliberations on what we plan to do next. We are likely to do ASEAN guideline on sustainable investment. So using this report as well as other sources, maybe including this webinar, if trying to see for some good inputs from here. Again, because we are quite committed to implement this issue and to address sustainability. Although we have to also recognize that each individual ASEAN country also have been trying to do their part as well. There have been several sustainability initiatives introduced by some, if not all, of ASEAN member states, although they try to do it in their own way. And they also try to do this while improving their investment regime, which we are quite aware of. So yes, maybe based on this, we can try to work together closer and more integrated way to address this sustainability issue. So again, thank you for everyone for your contribution to this process, for the having of the report as well as this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Tai Hyung. You know, we at the Heinrich Foundation, we're always keen to know when the reports that we commission actually have some influence or some effect on policy. So I think, you know, you're in a great position to be able to advise us if this report that from OECD, you know, helps to move the needle on ASEAN policy in any way. So, you know, keep in touch and and let us know, whether any of the recommendations in there have been specifically helpful in any way. But for now, I think it would be interesting to sort of pivot to some of the questions that I see coming in from people who are reading or who are watching us on this webinar. One of whom has asked a question which Park Donnie has talked about. Chris has sort of flagged that as well. One of the biggest challenges facing ASEAN, obviously, is that its countries continue to act independently rather than as cohesive single unit such as the EU. And obviously, it took 2 world wars before you got to a single cohesive unit in the European Union. We hope that doesn't happen here, but obviously that's an important question, and it also sort of begs, what are the key sectors that Southeast Asian firms should prioritize with this goal of reducing FDI restrictions. I don't know who among you wants to start, maybe Chris or Donnie or Chris, you want to take a crack at giving us an overview?
Yeah, sure. I mean, ASEAN's actually done a remarkable job over the last few years of driving in more FDI to the region. They've had record amounts coming in over the last couple of years. Unfortunately, that FDI is perhaps not the greenest in nature at the moment, although the OECD report does highlight actually a lot of the investment coming in from overseas is greener in nature than the investment being done by ASEAN themselves in themselves. The region, I think, Pak Donnie mentioned it just now as well, and the OECD report flags it up. The region needs to do a lot more in terms of making itself attractive for green and FDI to flow in. We need to do a lot more on energy transition. We need to get the right policies in place from governments, the right regulations in place from governments to make it more attractive. The region is doing that. They have more policies coming out. The ASEAN taxonomy actually is a great place to start in terms of helping green finance flow into the region. They do have a framework for a circular economy as well. There is a lot of work happening in the energy transition space these days, and Pak Donnie mentioned JETP as one of those, which I know Standard Chart plays a big role in. ADB's got things out there as well. The energy transition mechanism is another area. And we at the council, we've done a few reports on this about the need to crowd in more money into emerging markets in Southeast Asia. What's missing, the linkage between what governments are doing, what the financial institutions are themselves prepared to do in terms of funding, and then indeed then project owners who are looking for funding. They need to get better definition on their projects going forward at the same time. But there is no doubt, I said it in my opening remarks, it is a growth region. We are seeing huge amounts of growth in Southeast Asia, sorts of growth rates that Europe or the US or Japan would bite people's hands off for going forward. So the region is there. It is a pretty attractive place to invest in. I don't think they're getting their fair share of supply chain de-risking that's going on at the moment, or supply chain decoupling that's going on at the moment. And they should be getting a lot more of it, and that's because they're not functioning as a unified unit. They are competing with each other, and there are things they need to do better together to attract the FDI coming in. They need to play to their own strengths. You know, the power of 10 to the power of 10 is a lot bigger than a series of ones added up to 10, yeah. And they're not doing that in the region. They have plans. They have a comprehensive recovery framework agreement. We've got the ASEAN Economic Community's green blueprints out there. ASEAN's very good at coming up with ideas and less good at implementing them, unfortunately. If they only could implement some of these things, they would do a lot better at getting the FDI in. And I think, you get FDI in from companies in Europe in particular, it will come in and it will be greener in its nature, and it will be more sustainable in its nature. European firms tend to come, invest for the long term, invest in the communities, invest in their people, and will make sure actually the investments they do now going forward will be a lot greener. One thing I've said regularly, and I said it recently at the ASEAN finance ministers meeting to every finance minister, unless you start to green your economies a lot faster, the FDI from Europe will start to slow up.
Right. Yeah. That's really interesting, and obviously European firms have to abide by things like CBAM that's coming into effect and is driving a lot of change in the region. And I want to come back to this really interesting point that you made on de-risking. But before I do that, I just wanted to ask Pak Doni if he wanted to chime in on that original question.
Thanks, Chudwei, and I completely agree with Chris. I think actually Chris, picked up all the right sort of points over there. But just to add actually a bit more, I think that I think I would stress out actually that ASEAN is very different in terms of the economic sort of development within the country. So, but all of them are still developing, in essence, right? I mean, so you made that comparison with EU. So I think we can't quite compare ASEAN with EU, not at that stage yet, to be quite honest. And FDI, I saw the question, the follow-up questions there in the Q&A actually about, ASEAN sort of FDI linkages and so on. And look, ASEAN 2021 data actually over 170 billion, making it the third largest region in the world receiving FDI globally. So fantastic, everybody wants a piece of ASEAN, darling of the investors, to be quite honest. Now, the point is that all of ASEAN countries, including the largest income per capita country, which is Singapore, would require, in fact, Singapore actually gets the bulk of the FDI of that over $170 billion coming into ASEAN, given the Singapore sort of position as the regional hub, right? So all the countries in ASEAN still require that FDI very, very significantly. I made that point about Indonesia, but Vietnam and others as well, quite similar. Now, within that, it's not easy to just shift it, right? Actually overnight, that as simple as making that transition. It's actually very much in line actually with the way that the countries in ASEAN, I think that's a report by ADIS actually that highlighted the commitment on net zero, still very different, all of them actually have made commitment and so on and so forth, because the trajectory, the capacity of the state budget and the nation's sort of wealth actually differ significantly. Now, what ASEAN really need, and I think this has to be understood fully, because tackling climate change, sustainability requires everybody actually to work together. So all hands on deck globally. Now, this kind of JETB actually is one of the great example where there needs to be that assistance being put into ASEAN rather than just, if you will, demand on ASEAN needs to change the enabling environment and so on. I mean, yes, that is progressing, but the point is that to accelerate that further, ASEAN do need the capital to come in a much larger way from the OECD market into ASEAN to help achieve Paris Agreement, or even beyond that. I think that's no doubt about it. I think the whole emerging market actually would need that, and we are behind, to be quite honest. If we are, from a financing perspective, ultimately, actually, the trillions of capitals that you will get, there's a lot of studies actually, whether it's 3 to 5 trillion every year and so on and so forth, actually until 2030, but whatever it is, it's in the trillions of dollars, right? But that's not really flowing actually that. I mean, we did a survey at Standard Chartered last year that many of the global investors, asset managers, asset owners, essentially, cut long story short, actually 2/3 of the investment are still in the OECD markets rather than to the emerging markets. The outlook is great, but their existing investment, because of citing risk on credit risk, political risk, the usual sort of enforcement of laws and so on and so forth. The problem is that actually if the money doesn't flow into the emerging market, and specifically in our discussion today, it's ASEAN, that makes it very difficult actually for the ASEAN markets to help combat actually climate change impact. Not to mention that when we talk about the adaptation sort of economy, climate adaptation, I mean, that's even probably more pressing right now. But I'm not saying more important, but more pressing actually than the 1.5 degrees sort of by 2030, because adaptation needs actually has to happen right now. Otherwise, the losses have been quantified by many, UN bodies and so on, to be significant. That's not addressed, but that's, I think, actually the just sort of element needs to be had actually within that. So just to understand the ASEAN sort of context a bit further.
Right. No, that's really interesting. I kind of have a follow-up question, but it's not really linked to green investment, but it could be. When you and Chris talk about de-risking and that you're not seeing Southeast Asia getting its fair share of de-risking as supply chains reorganize, do you see any of it moving from China into Southeast Asia as a result of the US-China decoupling, megatrend? Is that something that's happening? Is that a thing?
Shall I?
Yeah.
Chris, you want to start?
Then Chris, yeah. Go ahead.
Pat, you go first, and then I'll chime in.
I'll pick it up. So the last few years, with the global supply chain shift and China opening, and this whole China plus one kind of strategy. I mean, depending on where you look at it, right? Actually, you look at it from the global companies, you look at it actually from the China itself, all the mega trends, as you said, actually way across the world. But ASEAN has seen the benefit of investment coming from Northeast Asia, predominantly China coming into ASEAN.
Right.
Very significant amount actually coming in across many sectors. It's not just manufacturing, it's the services, digital economy, across the board, essentially. Okay. Now, having said that, at the same time, we also see, given the rise of ASEAN, demographic bonus, young population, wealth, natural resources, you name it, actually from palm oil, rubber, all the way to renewable energy and nature-based solutions. We haven't talked even about the carbon credit, actually, where ASEAN actually would play a major role in the world of, voluntary carbon market. But the point is that, and ASEAN is actually getting integrated. I think actually the point was made by Chris earlier about ASEAN sort of initiatives, notwithstanding ASEAN very different and so on. I think, ASEAN has made significant progress. Don't compare ASEAN directly with the EU, but under the ASEAN Economic Community, maybe Taeho actually knows further about it from the Secretariat, right? But the ASEAN financial integration, your ASEAN cross-border payment, your QR, common QR and so on, and it's getting ASEAN even more connected. And that's really great for the region, right? But at the same time, we see that investment flows from other regions are also coming up. So it's not just from China. That's actually what I wanted to say in terms of the point, right? We see US, South Asia, Europe, to be actually sort of picking it up actually as well. So it's not just China. Yes, we see the China significant. Take, for example, Indonesia. China has moved up in the past, 4 or 5 years to be the second largest, if you combine China and Hong Kong, actually, then it becomes the largest FDI into Indonesia, for example. Right. But that position has moved up from the 4th or 5th, actually, 4 or 5 years ago into now. So yes. Wow.
That's really interesting. I'm sure it's going to be even more with this, as businesses try to evade the brunt of US policy. But Chris, you were going to add something.
Well, I'd echo what Pat Donny was just saying. There is flows coming down from China. Vietnam, by the way, I think is one of the biggest winners in the region for these investment flows coming down this de-risking, and that's partly because Vietnam itself, of course, is first of all quite a welcoming environment for investment, but also as a country they are in a large number of different trade agreements with Europe and CPTPP and RCEP and others, which means if you're going anywhere and you're manufacturing stuff, it's quite a good place to be. But I'll reiterate what I said. Whilst ASEAN's been doing very well for FDI, it's not getting enough of that supply chain de-risking. There are too many non-tariff barriers in the region, and supply chains straddle borders. It'll be unusual to have a supply chain which is all located within one country. And given that they straddle borders, the region needs to do more to tackle those NTBs.
Right. And by that, you mean digital trade, carbon credits? I mean, is that kind of the...
Well, it's not just that. It's harmonization of standards in the region. It's, right. Quotas on some imports. It's a whole raft of things out there, often designed to protect domestic industry. And it doesn't help when you're trying to get more FDI.
Yeah. Taehyung, do you have something to talk about, to chime in with on that point?
Not much to add. I mean, of course, we are trying as much as we could. In terms of investment policy, the officials continue to make improvement in the regime, and not just liberalization, like opening up, even how we improve competitiveness facilitation is the new emerging trend as well in investment policy making. That's what they have been doing, and it's a continuous process. So we continue sharing experience and how we improve, like how we trade is one thing, how we improve taxations, how do we set up one-stop center for investment applications, how do we set up aftercare. Those things are continuously being done, and of course digitalization is the new trend as well. So these efforts are continuously ongoing, and yes, sustainability is the new thing we should address more. So the lack of differentiation between green and non-green investment in terms of incentives, that's one thing that we will also try to address. So yes, things are still developing. Thank you.
Right. There's something that I wanted to pivot back to, picking up on what Pak Donnie said earlier, which is carbon credits. Obviously, this is it's a big piece of the future infrastructure. And in Southeast Asia, I mean, just from talking to people who are in the business, who are people who are trying to capitalize on this, on natural capital, people working on a peat swamp in Pekan, for example. One of the problems that they face, and I think people face this around the world, is the wide divergence in prices. And they find that, I mean, Singapore is trying to sort of be a hub on this, trying to come up with a carbon price, but the prices are just wildly varying. In some countries, some jurisdictions resist their projects going to Singapore to get a Singapore price because, they just feel that, well, we'd rather sort of try and figure out a price on our own. I mean, this obviously is an issue. I mean, how far away are we from a real convergence in Southeast Asian carbon credit pricing?
Okay, I think a few perspectives. First of all, the carbon market, the re-emergence of carbon market the last 4 or 5 years actually was driven by the voluntary side of things, because global companies, have a race against each other to commit net zero.
Yeah.
Like it or not, at the moment, the best intermediary offset instrument is carbon credit in the world. I know there's also criticism about carbon credit, actually, whether it's really true and how do we avoid duplication and so on. So it is, the voluntary carbon market essentially is still a new frontier in that sense, right? The compliance one actually has been there for 20 years, and particularly driven by EU ETS. Now, the point is that because of that, our group CEO, Bill Winters, actually chaired the first global task force on scaling of voluntary carbon market that then gave birth to it's almost like a quasi-regulator, the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Market, ICVC, and that aims to set the right standards, governance, and registrations and so on, avoid duplications and so on and so forth in the market. Now that is still obviously in play and work in progress. What I'm trying to say is that it is probably not, if you compare with other commodity sort of trading in the world, actually is probably not as mature and as established as that, but it's getting there. Because of that, there are differences in terms of the pricing and so on across the different carbon exchange markets, right? Because of that perception, even actually the origination country actually of that carbon credit is also actually still being sort of, there's still some doubts and so on and so forth. I think ASEAN is one of the largest, of course, actually, it's not just Indonesia that has one of the largest potential of carbon credit in the whole entire world, but with others, Malaysia, Cambodia, Myanmar, and others, right? So I think ASEAN should really put a lot of focus actually on creating actually that unity or conformity, if you will, to your point. I just wanted to highlight, but it's still early stage. Even in the world, it is still not actually right there yet, the way I would say it very simply. Still evolving, it's still evolving, but getting there, but it's still evolving. But within ASEAN, you said about Singapore wanted to be the hub for that. I know for a fact, Indonesian government is dead set actually to creating Indonesia as the international hub for that as well. Even within this, we should reconcile how best actually for ASEAN. wherever it is actually, but it should be for the betterment. And that's actually just pointing out actually a very obvious sort of point about that, what we talked about, the overarching sort of trend. There is also that there's a little bit of competition, which is healthy actually, but how do we collaborate actually to get the best for us, right?
Yeah. That seems like a case study for, just the kind of challenges that you're talking about. Chris, do you have any thoughts on this matter?
In terms of how ASEAN can collaborate further, I think, one of the impetus actually, or catalysts that can help that, because look, every country actually has their own national interests, right? I mean, and the economic actually are very different as well sometimes. Yeah. So that actually what is the difference. Within JETP, for example, Vietnam and Indonesia, we see a whole lot more opportunities for renewable energies and funded by the JETP, under the JETP umbrella. In Indonesia, it's slightly different. Why? Because Indonesia has excess electricity, while in Vietnam, actually, it's actually pretty much actually there. The problem with Indonesia is that coal-fired power plant actually is, about 64% actually that generates the grid. Anyway, these are very, very different, that the way and requires very different sort of approach and structuring and so on. But one key catalyst, I think, is that collaboration that is under the ASEAN Economic Community, where slowly but surely, actually, there's a lot more aspects that ASEAN governments actually feel that it's better actually for them to collaborate. So, for example, payments. It's very clear actually there's a lot of progress. Tai Hong maybe actually knows more actually about this, but we see actually a lot more awareness actually creating that. The QR code, for example, ASEAN taxonomy, as Chris mentioned, is a great step forward, right? But a lot more of this actually, as the benefit is realized by ASEAN countries, they would see actually that it's a lot more impetus for them actually to collaborate in other aspects as well. So, whether it's the carbon market, whether it is, in pitching to the global corporates to play a bigger part in the global supply chain world, actually together, hopefully actually that can go that way.
I'll add a few points onto that. I mean, the region, as Pakdoni said, is trying to do more things together. And you mentioned again the taxonomy. There are other things. I know there are ongoing discussions at the moment about having a common ASEAN-wide reporting standard on CSR and ESG type issues. And I think that would be extremely helpful as well. If it's the same approach, companies will feel, first of all, happier because they're not having to do different reports in different styles or different places. But it would also mean it's much easier to do comparisons across the region. And I think if they can somehow get themselves together and have a common approach on things like carbon pricing, that would be a big benefit for them.
Right. I've been told that we're bumping up against time. We have a couple more questions from the floor, which I don't think we might be able to get to. I don't know if you guys maybe want to fleck it in your closing comments. One of which is, isn't it high time that ASEAN countries start investing in themselves rather than continue to rely on FDI? Anyway, it's sort of time to round up, and Chris, Pakdoni, Tai Hong, you guys have in turn maybe make closing remarks.
I will. Shall I go first?
Yeah.
Pick up that intra-ASEAN investment question as well. Intra-ASEAN investment has been actually increasing, but it's not nearly where it should be. And most of the money, I'm afraid, is not in places which is easily investable from as well. We need to do a lot more to get the money working harder within Southeast Asia. The region has huge promise. I'm a big ASEAN fan myself. I think we are all incumbent, though, to do more to help ASEAN get greener, to make those investments greener, to get them to move ahead faster on climate action issues. European businesses, I think, are extremely well placed to do that, not just the financial institutions like Standard Chartered, but also our companies. Our companies actually make things, are very well placed to come in and help. Europe is a leader on things like energy transition, for instance. We need to work smarter and better together. Europe needs to stop wagging its finger so much, I think, at Southeast Asia, and needs to be more like a brother putting its arm around them and helping them along. That's probably where I should stop before I get myself in trouble.
Europe always wags its finger, that's true.
Yeah, maybe I'll go in next, and I think very similar to what Chris said. ASEAN is the future, clearly. For everybody else outside of ASEAN, it is time to work together with ASEAN governments, invest in ASEAN, help ASEAN on the sustainability part. And this is the thing. Another actually big point is that a big thank you to Heinrich Foundation, UK-ABC, the ASEAN Secretariat, for the OECD for the support and to keep highlighting ASEAN and raising awareness about ASEAN and the needs of ASEAN actually in the wider world.
Thank you, Pak Doni. Tae-hyung, you got any last words to add? You're on mute.
Okay. Yeah, just to affirm again that there are a lot of initiatives in terms of sustainability in ASEAN. In fact, many of the things that was mentioned earlier, for example, Pak Doni in the area of finance, that's one thing. But a lot of other areas are also trying to do sustainability related initiatives that in terms of economic, there is the current work that we are trying to do is, for example, ASEAN strategy on carbon neutrality, which is currently being discussed, is trying to synthesize and put them all together and trying to, so we have a more coordinated strategy. But this is all a work in progress. And again, member states already have their own sustainability initiative, even in investment. But again, that's individual effort, and it's good to have them coordinated. And yes, a lot of discussions are ongoing. So yes, we are working further on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tae-hyung. And thank you to everyone. And in particular, I would like to thank the EU-ASEAN Business Council, Chris Humphrey. Thank you so much for helping us to organize this this event. It's been pivotal. I wanted to thank Catherine, who's been so supportive and actually was the progenitor of this report. Iris, who played such a key role in working so hard on it. Pak Doni, Tae-hyung for joining us today, and to everyone out there, thank you for tuning in. We're about to show, I think, the QR code where you can download the report. And to subscribe to our Heinrich Foundation newsletter, you can go to our website. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Pleasure, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.